Where's Simon today? Well, Simon is at home alone, babysitting a few dogs, and he's trying to recover himself from the flu, which is why there hasn't been an episode of The Word for the Week for a bit. But here we are. We're sheltering from the storm that's blowing around outside. Storm Bram, I believe. And we're ready here, as long as the dogs don't take the apparatus flying as they charge around the kitchen. We're ready to kick off with this week's Word for the Week, which really has a lot to do with a current social, economic, it's getting political issue, which is playing out at the moment in rural Wales. See, there's a lot of discussion around in rural Wales at the moment about government action and the future of the family farm. There's a lot of talk about it being in serious, challenging decline. Now, by family farm, we tend to mean that the farm is owned and worked as a business by one family. They and it tend to be rooted in the local culture, society, economy, and they make a large contribution here in rural Wales, not only to the preservation of the Welsh language, but to other local businesses, institutions like schools and village halls, and other forms of employment. And for hundreds of years, they've been drivers of the Welsh rural economy. And their viability does seem to be being put in question at the moment by government policies and interventions determined far away, you might say, in Cardiff, or even further away in Westminster, by largely urban people who really don't seem to have understood much of what's going on with this. And that's causing great tension and great worry in rural communities. The issue for us today is what is replacing these family farms? Big corporate or almost corporate farming organisations and international non-farming organisations now putting food production, agricultural land into non-food producing, non-farming use. What about the jobs of those displaced from family farms? This is where James 5 comes into the picture. Either those people are displaced from the rural communities, or they take up jobs on a wage, or perhaps a small business. They start up a small business serving the new landlords with not enough of that work to go round. You see how the structure of the economy's moved. And those who stay in their locality are now subject to human resources and payment regimes and policies of the large corporate institutions. And yes, I understand you may well be thinking, why am I banging on about that when today we're actually looking at James chapter 5 verses 1 to 6? Well, you'll see why in a few minutes. Let's open up this text and see what's inside. Firstly, James 5 kicks off in verse 1 with a confrontational call, a summons. You see, James opens this chapter not with gentle counsel, but with a strong message. In fact, a positively prophetic shout. It's a strong, hey you, I'm talking to you, Verse 1. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming on you. Lovely sermon, Pastor, says nobody leaving church that day. Right then, now listen, agenon is the Greek there. Right then, listen to me. It's a summons to court, not a polite invitation. And the only other time James uses this exact phrase is just previous in chapter 4, verse 13, where he confronts the self-assured merchant classes. But now he turns on the agricultural elite, the estate owners, the powerful land controllers. Now then, can you see where I was heading back at the start there? The addressees are addressed directly as the rich, plusiois, and commanded to lament, to weep, to wail. It's an ironic reversal. Those who are secure are told to weep over their coming loss. What are they being urged to do? Well, as an aorist imperative plural, it's a call to lament. Two verbs in parallel intensify the rhetorical command. He's piling up language, making it urgent, creating a sense of decisive action being needed. Irony being created because the rich are told to perform the lament of the poor because of what's coming to them for the way they've acted. Because of, or on account of, the sorrows that are coming upon you. Now, there's a time marker there. It says about to. It's going to happen now. It's projecting judgment forward, but not far forward. It's anticipatory lament, but it's not something to worry about sometime down the road. It's coming. It's here. It's knocking at the door. And this is what you've got coming at you pretty much right now, says James. And the expression there translates to the sorrows that are about to come on you. About to come on you. James frames everything eschatologically. Judgment is not hypothetical. It is imminent. So here in chapter 5, James is speaking like an Old Testament prophet, really, addressing the oppressors of the agriculturalists, the oppressors of the people who do the work on the land. And he's issuing like a divine indictment, not inviting dialogue, but summoning to judgment. And his target is very clear. It's not the wealth in the abstract, but you rich people as a social class who've behaved in a particular way. It's the rich that are commanded to perform the grief, normally associated with the ruined poor. It's an ironic reversal. Can you see what's gone on there? And he's going to refine that targeting shortly as he describes more precisely what these particular rich people have been up to. Just please notice that it's about how they've made themselves rich. That's what it is, not the fact that they are rich. It's how they've done it. But there's a real sermon punch here from James. James is saying, you think you are secure because you think you're rich. Brace yourselves. What's coming should make you howl. Well, James then moves on in verses 2 and 3 to the signs and the symptoms that are bringing them into this sick situation. Look, it's like this. When you go to see the doctor and you then enter their consulting room, they're looking for two primary things from you at the outset. They're looking for signs of what ails you and the symptoms. Did you realize they're two different things? Put it very simply, signs are what an outsider can objectively observe about you. Symptoms are what you feel yourself. And those symptoms are naturally going to be very subjective because they're what you feel. Now, as the doctor diagnoses the situation of a patient, that's what's on his mind. And as James looks at the people at the heart of these verses, James describes signs, objective indicators of the disease of greed. Signs, says James. Your riches have rotted. The idea is one of moral rot made visible as material decay. Your garments have become moth-eaten. It's a perfect passive there. It suggests irreversible ruin. You can't do anything about it. You are passive in the process. You can only watch your flashy dressing getting eaten away. And then he says, your gold and silver have rusted. A shock word. Gold doesn't rust. But James uses this verb for iron corrosion of their gold, the most imperishable metal, to make his point. Even what you treat as eternal is already under judgment. And as a perfect tense there, it signals that the decay has already begun and will only continue. Your gold is rusting. The wealth itself becomes evidence of moral rot. And that fits Old Testament prophetic ways of going on, where decaying riches symbolize God's indictment. You could look at Jeremiah 17, verse 11. You could look at Ezekiel 7 and verse 19 for that sort of idea. There's your signs. But then there's the symptoms, and that's what they feel. And you know what, says James, verse 3b, he's delivering his punchline. You have hoarded treasure in the last days. Now, that's a parody of Jesus' teaching. Instead of laying up treasure in heaven, they've laid up evidence for their own condemnation. Here's the irony. In the last days, they're stockpiling perishable wealth. Now, what is the point of that? You hoarded. You treasured up. There's the irony, you see. Treasured up, not good things, but judgment. Now, everybody seems keen to contrast Paul's theology with James's, but there seems to be clear echoes here of Romans. Romans 2 verse 5. Because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. Now, at the very least, that's a grim parody of Jesus' treasure in heaven theme in Matthew 6, 19 to 21. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You think that's pretty decisive, but James has got still more to pile on. It's in the last days when they've done this. It's on the verge of their eternity. There's a temporal dative. In the last days implies heightened moral culpability. Of all times to be grasping for wealth unjustly, you did it in the very moment of God's final reckoning. And James signals both the urgency and the madness of hoarding wealth precisely when God's kingdom is at the threshold. You've hoarded treasure in the last days, stockpiling perishable wealth when it's about to perish. James is signalling the urgency and the craziness of hoarding wealth precisely when God's kingdom is at the threshold. And what's the effect of that folly? This is no less than an eternal error. It will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you've hoarded treasure. Now they feel that the shine has gone off their wealth. The thrill of luxury clothes no longer thrills. This is a creeping sense of futility. Their own souls are feeling the eating away. And James explains this with terrifying poetry. Their corrosion will be a testimony against you and will eat your flesh like fire. Not literal flesh eating, but prophetic language echoing Isaiah and Amos. Their possessions become their prosecutor. Their wealth becomes the fire that devours their life. It will eat you. More specifically, it will eat your flesh. Not literal cannibalism, but fiery eschatological metaphor. You're going to feel it in yourself. Corrosion, a consuming agent, destructive, the fire. It evokes Old Testament divine judgment, the sort of thing that's described in Amos 5:6, Isaiah 66, 15 to 16. The wrath itself is pictured as eating up their lives, a self-inflicted, richly prophetic piece of imagery. And the rhetorical effect is a shocking reversal. The riches they thought would feed them instead devour them, will eat your flesh like fire. Now, James's warning is so very clear. This life is not a practice. It is either an investment or it is a dead loss. We are accountable for what we do with our capital. how we invest it. One life, invest it for life. Well, there's the observable, objective stuff. The signs of their spiritual disease. And then there's the symptoms, how they feel it. And the real tragedy isn't that their wealth is failing. It's that they've invested heavily in the one portfolio guaranteed to collapse at the final audit. You know this is what's happening, says James. You can feel it, people can see it. So thirdly, he comes to the charge sheet in verses 4 to 6. He turns full prophetic prosecutor now. Behold, he says, commanding attention. Here comes the evidence. Charge 1, wage theft. James 5:4. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. See what's happened now in these last couple of verses here. The passage has moved from metaphor, rusty gold and all that, to concrete charge. You've stolen wages, you've been engaging in murderous conduct, culminating in this end-time judgment. And this is legal accusatory language, the language of condemnation. For withholding wages, for living luxuriously while others labour, and final condemnation as evidence in the last days. Passage moves from a metaphor to a concrete charge, stolen wages, murderous conduct, culminating in an end-time summons to judgment. Behold, behold, attention. It's often used to introduce a striking revelation, is that expression that's there in the original. And that they're being accused of a violent act. Not mere negligence, but consciously and deliberately treating the people who work the land badly. They've withheld the wages of labourers. And that's a major indictment. That's a serious thing. The wages they withheld, the language there is the language of a robbery. And it's personified. The wages that you withheld are crying out to God. Now this is huge Old Testament stuff. And remember, James is writing to largely a Jewish audience. It's Exodus language. The language directly evokes Exodus, where the oppressed cry out. Exodus 2, 23 to 24. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Their cry for help rose up to God, and God heard their groaning way back there in Exodus. And we know what happened next. Now this matters because James uses the exact same divine hearing formula. This crying out has reached the ears of the Lord of hosts, says James 5:4. Just the language that was used in Exodus of the slaves, the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. But it's not just Exodus language here. There's Sodom and Gomorrah language here. See, the prophetic tradition often links oppression and violence and economic injustice to the same crying out that rose up from Sodom. Genesis 18, 20 to 21. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Their sin is very grave. I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the cry, says God. Now, why is that relevant? James and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, are in the same semantic domain. Sodom's cry in the prophets becomes shorthand for the cries of the oppressed. Isaiah makes the connection implicit. Isaiah 3 verses 14 and 15. Oppressing the poor there is Sodom-like behaviour. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, says the Lord? Get the same hookup in Ezekiel 16:49. This was the sin of Sodom. Pride, excessive food, prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. So when James says the withheld wages cry out, He taps into that entire biblical tradition, where the cry is the legal complaint of the exploited. And God, the judge, hears and responds. That's a sleeping dog making little barks. Don't worry about it. This language about their wages crying out, it reflects Abel's blood in Genesis as well. Do you remember that? Probably the strongest textual background of what James is saying here in James 5 verse 4. Because if you go into Genesis 4 verse 10, it speaks of the voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, says God. In Genesis, it's Abel's blood that cries out to God. And here in James, it is the worker's unpaid wages that cry out to God. In Genesis, Abel's cry reaches God. And in James, the cry reaches the ear of the Lord Almighty. This is parallel stuff. In Genesis, Abel is the innocent victim, and here the workers are the innocent victims. The wage labourers who are displaced from their land and are grubbing around for the big landlords who've got it all together and are now not paying their wages. See, in Genesis 4, Abel is oppressed by one of superior strength, and that's what's happening in the wage labourers in James's day, in James chapter 5 as well. But here's the crucial bit. Abel's blood becomes the biblical paradigm of injustice that itself cries out, and which God, hearing it, personally avenges. Now, the New Testament authors treat this as a category. Hebrews 12:24. Abel's blood speaks, it says. Revelation 6, 9 and 10. The martyr's blood cries out. So when James takes an inanimate object, the wages, and gives it a voice, he uses exact Abel language. And the verb in James is the same verb that's used for injustice, echoing before God in the Old Testament. And James says, their cries, these labourers you haven't paid, have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. They've arrived, as perfect tense, and they remain before God. Evidence logged. Case active. And there is the root cause of the problem these big landowners are going to have with God. Not because they are big landowners, but because of the ways they exploit the power that their situation has given them over their wage labourers. So now James builds the case against them out from that deep-rooted structural situation. That was charge 1. Here comes charge 2. Charge 1, you haven't paid the labourers their wages. Charge 2, self-indulgence. You have lived luxuriously and in self-indulgence. And it's on the backs of what they've been doing to these people, you see. James uses rare words here, emphasising softness, luxury, decadence. It's what they have done with their position of power. That's the problem. And whilst they no doubt felt the position justified their action, it did not. There's a responsibility on the big guys to look after the little guys properly. Worse than that, it was an act of self-destruction to treat their wage labourers or contractors, or however we're going to voice it, in that way. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. Now you can see the stark agricultural imagery here. It's of a beef animal perhaps being fattened and fattened and fattened, doing really well before it goes to the butcher, lapping up the lovely stuff that's in their trough, all the while being fattened right before the fall of the slaughterman's knife. So they haven't been paying the labourers their wages. They've been living in luxury and self-indulgence on the back of that. And then third charge, judicial violence. You've condemned and murdered the righteous person who does not resist you. See, again, their power, their position of power on the land and everything else, gives them outrageously undue civic influence with government and courts. And they're abusing that to serve their own cause, even though that's going to prove a very short-term sort of advantage because God has heard and seen. And the grammar suggests systematic injustice. Their courtrooms favour the powerful. Their actions squeeze the poor to death economically, perhaps literally. The righteous person is powerless, but God hears that person. Again, there's a big punch in the sermon. James wants the poor to know the silence of the righteous on earth is not the same as silence in heaven. Their cries have already entered the court of the Lord of hosts. And that's being drawn out as a global principle that will apply to the way things work out everywhere, including rural Wales. So let's draw a conclusion. Who is James talking to? In James 4:13-17, the previous passage we looked at last time, James rebukes the mobile merchant class for the way they're behaving. In James 5:1-6, he rebukes the landowning agrarian elite. And he uses the same formula, agenun, pay attention, I'm calling you to court. Two different groups, one unified message. Worldly wealth strategies fail, particularly when they're founded on the assumption that there is no God to whom everyone is accountable. In the first century dispersal, the diaspora, people spread out with persecution, most Christians were not landowners. Many were forced into becoming day labourers, tenant workers, seasonal harvesters. They were at the mercy of wealthy estate owners, many of whom would have been non-believers. So James is not primarily rebuking Christians here. He's announcing God's judgment on their oppressors, like an Old Testament prophet would. And he'll go on to encourage the believers to endure in verses 7-11, perhaps we'll see next time, warning them not to envy or imitate the lifestyle of the rich oppressor. Okay then, so what's this got to do with rural Wales? Because the dynamic in James is not first century versus now, it's power versus vulnerability, control versus dependence. The principle applies across the ages. The pattern remains recognisable. And where absentee landowners, corporate acquisitions of farmland, local workers becoming contractors on land they once farmed, wage pressure, withheld pay, insecure employment, late invoice payments. The rich magnifying their comfort while the labourer squeezes by. James is saying, God hears the cry of the reaper even when no one else does. James's message lands with prophetic force. This life is not a rehearsal. Even for those people who wield great temporal power with no fear of the one to whom we are all accountable. We're all stewarding our capital. Not just our money, but time, energy, reputation, influence. And either it becomes treasure that testifies for us, or stuff treasured up that testifies against us. And the rich landowners that James is describing have wielded their power exploitatively and invested in the wrong future. The exploited are assured that God has already opened their case file. And humanity, inside church and out of it, is called to wise, just, kingdom-shaped stewardship. One life, one Lord. James is saying, invest all you've gained or been given for life. Well, powerful stuff from James. I hope it helps encourage, stimulate to a more fruitful and satisfying life for all of us this week. And whatever happens in your week and whatever your circumstance, I pray God gives you a really good week. If I can help you, pray for you, hit me up in the messages. Always a pleasure to hear from you.